Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our session on how to capture business value on your transformation journey. When we get into topics like transformation, I think it's really important we start off with a definition of terms because Gartner has a very specific definition and meaning of transformation, and more specifically, digital business transformation. We look at this through the lens of a business model. So transformation is about using technology in a way that is essentially altering your business model in some way. A lot of organizations in our conversations tend to use transformation, digital business transformation, in, shall we say, a more liberal way. But when you have technologies that are really being directed to optimizing your existing business model, well, that's what we refer to as digital optimization. So, digital business transformation has a far more significant set of outcomes, and there's going to be a set of associated challenges to come with that. So it's important for us to understand that as we start to think about business value. And that then leads us to the next definition, which is, well, what is business value? So this is survey work that we've done here, so ranking the most critical business outcomes when thinking about technology investments here. The thing that I would highlight is that there isn't just one definition of what business value is. There's obviously a few that weight a little bit more. Process efficiency is one of those things that runs across the whole of the business. But if we take a look at other ones, things like increased revenue are probably going to be things that rank relatively higher for the sales manager. Because when we look at these weightings, what we're doing is we're weighting it across all of the different job categories that we're looking at, right? But if we were to do a cut, then the sales manager is going to have more of an emphasis around revenue. The human resource manager would be probably looking more at employee retention. So this is a good news story in the sense that from a CIO standpoint, there's a lot of different routes to realize business value on your way to try to do digital business transformation. How do you go about doing that, though? This is where we bring in a framework that Gartner has called our building blocks of digital business. These building blocks come out of 10 years of experience we have interacting with organizations as they're going through their own transformation journey. Now, I'm going to get into some of these all these building blocks in just a second, but the first thing I want you to do is to take a look at the core categories that we're looking at here. In order to be able to do this, the first thing we have to do is, within the business, as we're seeking value, is to create an ambition to get these different business leaders to start to see how technology can bend the business models in ways that are beneficial from them. Once they understand it, once we have the buy-in, then we have to move to mobilize the organization. Because if you are doing things with your business model, there's a very good chance that you're going to have to do things outside of what your normal operating principles, your normal governance structures are. We would always recommend that you do these things starting off small, and then the ones that win, you scale those things up. So scaling the opportunities is the last of those three lenses that we can look at these building blocks from. The point I'd want to make here, though, is as you look at these across these different dimensions, this is essentially a process perspective. This is how you're going to play this out in the business processes of the organization. But if we look at these same building blocks in a vertical fashion, we actually have a set of perspectives relative to how you lead an organization through digital business transformation. And there are three core areas that we're doing that. The first is we have to shift our thinking that we're focused on a specific destination, and we want to start to think about iteration. We have to go from a staffing standpoint to how do we control people within the context of strictly defined business processes, and how do we empower people to have more autonomy to take advantage of these opportunities that emerge. And then finally, we have to move from a thinking around how we're making investments from certainty, established ROI, to greater risk-taking. So let's dive into each of the three areas. And we'll start off with the topic of moving from destination to iteration. Perhaps it's a little bit trite to say that, the journey is the reward, right? Or whatever it might be that we're going to say here. But it is kind of important when we think about the notion of doing transformation. As we do transformation, and as we bend the business model, you can set whatever metric you want for whether you are going to, what it means to achieve that. So for example, from a private sector standpoint, you could say, look, if we get 50% of our revenue from digital revenue streams, we can say that we've been successful in digital transformation. Or from a government standpoint, 50% of our service delivery is through digital. Then we can say that we're successful in that transformation journey. But once you've done that, what you're going to find is your organization is now more firmly within the digital economy. And the digital economy is inherently what we would call hyper-complex. It's an environment of asymmetric competition. It's an environment of very different types of funding and finance models. So you are inherently going to be in a more complex environment that is going to mandate a constant state of iteration. So we bring in our stack of digital business blocks into this. And the first one is this notion of trend spotting and future sensing. The one thing, of course, I think this is apparent to all of us what this means, but the one caution that I would put on this is to avoid what I call visionaries disease, right? Which is, this is looking so far out into the future that there's no possible way you can be wrong because nobody's ever going to check as to whether your original prediction was accurate or not. So I would say keep shorter time horizons, right? Look for the 1 to 2 year time horizon in particular. And this also goes particularly when we're talking about emerging technologies like AI, right? How can we start to get some sort of pragmatic impact in that shorter window? We're going to have agile resource development and utilization, so agile techniques become important in this. And we're also going to have transparent feedback loops. The transparency here is transparency not just to management and leadership, but ideally transparency to the whole of the organization. Now, as you go through this process, as you move towards this iterative mindset, what you're going to run into is a really important problem, and that is change fatigue. So when we look at this here, the research results that we have here on the challenges organizations have in terms of the most impact on business outcomes of technology investments, you can see that the change fatigue is rated as the highest. Now, I don't think that change fatigue is the problem in and of itself. I think change fatigue is actually a symptom of a bigger problem. And that problem is a misalignment between management and the rest of the organization. Many years ago, early in my career at Gartner, I was doing research work primarily focused towards the people that reported to a CIO, application leaders, enterprise architects, et cetera. And then I moved into the CIO group. And the thing that hit me immediately is that CIOs are thinking big picture, right? They're trying to engage at the executive level on aligning strategies. But the people that report to the CIO are way down in the operational weeds, right? They're not connected in any meaningful way with these larger issues that the CIOs are facing. So the change fatigue, I think, is coming from the fact that the people within the organization are living in an environment of goals which are not achievable, objectives which seem to change, metrics which are bound in something that might have been relevant months ago and are no longer relevant to the current situation. So part of all of this is getting the alignment between management and the staff. And I think the goal that we have with the iterative mindset is that we want their goals to be the iteration, right? That they succeed by showing their ability to iterate, not tolerate the iteration that's happening to them. So when we look at the organizations and when studies we've done of the highly successful CIOs that have been doing this, we see a couple of common traits here. One is the proactive change management, right? So they are translating these strategic objectives into things that are relevant to the staff in the organization. Cultural adaptability, empowerment, and collaboration, I think, also flows out of the work that CIOs are doing to scale agile methodologies. Agile could start as a development methodology, but in order for it to really make a difference, the leading CIOs start to transform the whole of the organization structure, rethink silo structures, and I'll touch on that in just a second. And the best thing that you can do is align that work with what matters to your customer, right? If the staff can see that work relating there, it's much easier for them to be able to adopt that iterative mindset. One thing you should keep in mind is how are we going to be able to identify where there might be a change fatigue issue occurring in the organization. One of the interesting points here is that when we've looked at change management in organizations, we find that when it comes to big significant changes, those only represent about 4% of the volume of change that the staff has to deal with. The other 96 are this raft of these small changes that often go under the radar for management. So what Medtronic, this is a medical device manufacturer in Ireland, what they did is they set a bunch of criteria here, which were both subjective and objective criteria. So you can see, for example, some of these here. Objective criteria might be decrease in discretionary effort, and then what they would be looking at would be things like proposing fewer ideas, helping teammates less. So in other words, they have a great framework that managers can go in and start to identify if there's a change fatigue problem, and then move to that with response and effort to fix that. So let's move to the second of the leadership mind shift changes here, which is control to empowerment. And I want to start off with this quote from Laszlo Bock. He was the former senior vice president of people at Google. And so he says here, if you give people freedom, they will amaze you. Empowerment leads to innovation, engagement, and business results. Now, when you read this, it just sort of sounds right, doesn't it? Right? It is very much of the zeitgeist. Because in many ways, we've elevated empowerment to being something which is almost like a primary unassailable good. But I want you to reread this statement, and I want you to reflect on it a little bit. And let's be honest, this is nonsense. This is nonsense, because we know, yes, with some people, if we give them freedom, they are absolutely going to amaze us, right? Some people are going to disappoint you. Other people are going to disappoint themselves. And there's going to be a small group that might get you in trouble with the law, all right? Now, that does not mean we're suggesting here that what you really need to do is to patronize them and treat them like children and control every movement. Obviously, there's a balance somewhere between the two. What we're hoping to do here is we want to give people the freedom to use the skills they have in collaboration with others, aimed at shared objectives that, when accomplished, are something that everybody can take pride in. That's really when the amazement starts. So the stack of things that we're looking at in this particular case, one is an outcome-oriented investment approach, right? So outcomes are really important, getting away from the process and what is it that we're trying to achieve. And in particular, if we go back to this point about the importance of the connection to the customer, the more those outcomes are lined up to what matters to your customer, the best situation that you're going to be in. Value-producing digital foundations are based on this notion of composable architectures. So in order to be able to respond to how people are bending and flexing with the empowerment they give, we need to have IT systems that are not going to lock people in to certain approaches. And then finally, intelligent automation, augmentation, and decision-making. I think this is where AI is going to be a very important tool. One of the things I think we'll be speaking more about in the not too distant future is the role that AI is going to have in automating the administration tasks in organizations. As particularly as the technology moves into agentic AI, it's going to be more capable of doing that work. So if we can automate something like that, it's time and empowerment that we're giving back to the staff. Now, key thing also in this is that we remember that empowerment is ultimately a team sport. Having a bunch of individuals is not the route to success, and it's also not the best working environment for people to have. Again, integrated strategy developments, collaborative cultures, all these things are the foundation that we create that. And it's also important here that the targets are clear. I'll make this point again in just a second. But where we can align the people in those collaborative efforts towards things which are strategic to the organization is when that empowerment is also aligned with what executive leadership wants in an organization. So, providing some of the tools to be able to support that. There's an interesting case study here from an organization called Guangfa Securities in Guangzhou, China. And just before I get into this, I just wanted to, when I was looking at this, it reminded me of a story that my father told me. My father, in his latter years, spent time in education, and particularly with kids that were the problem classes, right? The ones that none of the teachers wanted to deal with. And he had a process that he told me. When he went into the class, the first thing that would happen, the first 5 minutes, the kids would all gang up on him, right? He was the authority figure, so they'd have to, go after him. And he let them do it. Talk to him, why is it that, what's your issue? What are your problems? And they would share it. And after that, when he went through that, say it was a math class, he would say, all right, class, I want you to tell me who the top 5 kids are in this class. Who are the ones that know math the best? And the kids would say, oh, it's this person, this person, this person. Great, 4 of them. We're splitting off into 4 teams, and each of you 4 top kids, you're responsible for teaching your team how to do this activity. And suddenly the dynamic changed, right? The lack of respect that they showed to the teacher was not something they were prepared to do with their fellow students. Then there was an element of competition between the teams. And what he found at the end of it is that the kids had a fantastic education experience, right? It just reminded me, because this organization, they invested in an analytics platform which was supposed to support the front line and the staff. And I'm sure this has never happened to you, where you actually invest in technology and people don't use it. I'm sure that has never happened to you guys, but it happened to them. So the solution that they had to this was to create a core team, what they called the analytics vanguard, the people who really knew how to use that stuff. Then they gave them special access to the information, and then they were tasked with the responsibility of passing that knowledge on how to use the platform onto the rest of the organization. So they created the same dynamic. In a 3-month period of time, they saw a 5.6 times increase in the number of reports which are being created out of the platform. So this is another example of how we can do this type of activity. And again, it's that transparency in analytics that supports the empowered team that we have. The last one is the move from certainty to risk. And again, if I come back to the core that we're getting out and we're making changes into the business model of the organization, then you are going to be doing things which are inherently risky, right? Just the nature of the beast. A lot of organizations end up shooting themselves in the foot because the types of investment thresholds that they have are based on essentially optimizing the existing business model that they have. But if we're going to get into a world of transformation, you're going to have to be taking some risky bets. So we need to be able to do that. Now, if we look at the stack of things that we have, again, you'll notice it's the adherence to the strategic priorities that are important. One of the best ways to figure out how to calculate risk is how much does that align to the strategic objectives. That's a super important thing. We need adaptive governance on this. I'll get into that in just a second. And also an enterprise innovation function. So a lot of organizations talk about doing innovation when we speak to them, big commitments from senior leadership. But then when we look at the actual way they're doing it, there might be one person allocated to be the innovation lead. They have no budget whatsoever, right? So the leading organizations are going to have some type of staffing structure where you can actually approach innovation in a programmatic way. Ideally, there should be some funding attached to that group so that they can do some form of seed funding within the organization for innovation initiatives. What we're looking for here is this notion of optionality. This is coming out of the venture capital community. So the idea here is that you want all of your organizations to be thinking about this transformation in the idea that we're going to place 100 bets, and 95 of them, we're going to lose our money on them. Now, do you hear that fail fast thing? Well, ideally you want to win, but if you're going to fail, don't fail fast, fail cheap. That's really what you're aiming for. So 95 of these, you're going to fail. 4 of them, you're going to make a reasonable return on. 1 of them is going to be the home run. 1 of them is going to pay for all the losses and more. But the thing is, you don't know which one it is. So you're placing the bets, you're letting the ones fail quick, and you're letting the cream rise to the top, and you're scaling it as you see the success. That's the general game plan that you have. Now, as you do that, you're going to run into having to consider the risk side of all of this. Now, I don't want to go into any detail. This is something that one of the large Australian telecommunication companies, I'll let you guys figure out which of the 3 that is, a model that they have. Now, I don't want to go into details about how this model is actually operating, but I want to point out a couple of different things here. In this particular case, what they're doing, as you can see here, they have the risk appetite or residual ratings. Over at option number 2, what they were trying to do is say, okay, we have risk number 2. How can we move that risk into an acceptable area? And risk number 3 is definite no, can we move it over in that area? Now, as they were doing that, what happened was risk number 4 and risk number 5 emerged as a result of that work. And they were both in the red zone. So that was not an option that they pursued. And as you can see on this other one here, they were trying to move risk number 3 over. Risk number 4 popped up, but was in an acceptable zone. So that was a option that they were able to move forward to. Why do I bring this up? It's because when we are doing transformation work, you are actually entering into different markets. And by entering the market, you change certain sets of conditions. And risks that you weren't expecting are going to emerge as a result of that. So you've got to have a way to be able to anticipate and see those risks and respond to those. I would also say that this is relevant to our AI investments. I've looked at a lot of AI policies, and one of the things that I've seen is that organizations think that they can figure out all the potential risks of AI and put it in a policy document, right? So don't cause an intellectual property problem, or make sure there's no bias, or you're using it ethically. Right? We don't even know what the definition of bias or ethics is, but we'll put it in there anyway. And what ends up happening is when you think you can figure the risks all out up front, you are essentially telling everybody, don't you dare play with this, right? Because if one of those things, risks shows up and we don't even know how it's going to happen, you're going to be held responsible. So the better way to approach this is for us to think again through an innovation funnel and say the first thing we want to do is establish a business case which validates the pilot. If the pilot proves the feasibility of the project, then we will do the risk assessment relative to where we've gotten. Then you start to discover what the actual risks are, they're in context, and then we can make proper risk-benefit analysis. Now, we're getting into the innovation side of things. An important statistic that we have here is that innovation is not something that generally sits wholly under the remit of the CIO. In reality, 64% of CIOs are telling us that innovation is a shared responsibility with the business leaders. It's actually only 17% of CIOs that have complete control over innovation. And so what we're looking at in this particular case is dealing with that who's ultimately responsible by setting up a concept of having an innovation as a service. So we can look at the subcomponents of driving innovation in a programmatic fashion. We would need things like service level offerings, common platforms, integration pathways, process, principles, et cetera. Set those up as a service that can be delivered to the business. Then what we do is a similar type of risk model here, and we can start to establish, based on something like the criticality of the business and the complexity, we can then determine what the nature of the relationship looks like between business and IT, and can, like, once again, contextually apply that innovation as a service. The last one I'd want to point out to you here is how we can start to bring these innovations together, risk-assessed innovations in a way that drive transformation. And one of the things that you're eventually going to find is that one of the primary tools you have to drive digital transformation is digital productization, bringing things into product and finding markets for those. Now, this is one of the methodologies that was used by a large Canadian manufacturing organization, that they recognized what they needed to do was look for critical future capabilities, right? Bind that with technology and also the unique firm assets. And when you can find the intersection between those three things, you have what they call a digital wedge point. Now, there's another term that I would use for this, and it's called your intellectual property, right? Really important for us as CIOs to recognize that a big part of what you're doing, particularly around transformation, is you are creating assets for the organization, right? You're not just driving the operations. You're not just a cost line on the income statement. You're actually growing the balance sheet of the organization. So once you start to see this, right, in this context, then comes the challenge of finding the market for that product, determining a price point, and there's a whole set of other cascading activities in terms of operating models, go-to-market models. But we're certainly seeing leading organizations coming up with some amazing solutions in this area. One of the favorite examples I have, which I've used quite often, is the online grocery company, Ocado, based in the UK. Now, Ocado built the platform that they needed to support that business. And they recognized that there was actually a market for that platform in and of its own right. So they productized it. They called it the Ocado Smart Platform. And they're selling it to grocery firms, in other words, potentially their competition for the actual product, all around the world. Champion Group in France, Kroger in the United States. I believe both Kohl's and Woolworths are using the Ocado Smart Platform for their online grocery business. So this is emanating out of IT. This is a compelling example of what we mean by digital business transformation. So, again, give your organization the tools to discover and capture the value and let it figure out the best ways to get there. The key point here is, if you demonstrate the leadership principles that we're talking about, I believe that what you're going to find is an organization that is excited to work with you, right? That they don't necessarily need to be directly led. They're there to create the reality. So work with them, give them the opportunity to allow you to be successful. I'll finish with a couple of research notes that you guys can take a look at to follow this up. Other than that, thank you to everybody for your time. Have a good rest of the conference.